Well, greetings to everyone that is tuning in for this week's Teacher Talk. My name is Christopher Hanson. I have the distinct privilege of serving my community as the Director of Music Education and Orchestral Activities at Seattle Pacific University in Seattle, Washington. For those that might be watching for the first time, Teacher Talks is something that I established a couple months ago to stay connected with my students during closures caused by the global pandemic. And it has blossomed into an incredible opportunity to connect with artists and educators around the world and talk about specifically music and education, things that we're thinking about, that we're struggling with, that we need to celebrate in this truly remarkable time. There is so much that we are all struggling with and dealing with. And it has been amazing to utilize technology to connect with people, friends and colleagues, students and peers, and just talk about music and education and start to imagine what the future has in store for all of us. This is our 20th episode of Teacher Talks, which I am absolutely floored to be announcing. I am so grateful for everybody that has been watching these conversations, that has participated by posting comments and questions or reaching out to me in between the talks to suggest people to converse with or topics that we should be thinking about. I also want to thank everybody that has been sharing the links for the Teacher Talks or has been visiting our YouTube playlist that has all of the Teacher Talks that we've done so far archived. So this is number 20. I can't believe it. So when we did the 10th episode, I decided to switch it up a little bit. And once we reached that double digit, I celebrated by just doing a teacher talk that was done live, in which I was addressing different questions or concerns or comments and just sort of feeding off of whatever it is that people were interested in discussing. And so now that we've reached this new milestone of our 20th episode, I wanted to do something similar. So today, I'm the only person that's going to be on screen, but I am not the only person that is a part of this conversation. Everybody that is watching and participating, I would love to hear from you with comments, questions, concerns, topics that you think that we should be discussing or thinking about right now. And so this is open to everybody that's watching on YouTube and Facebook. I am monitoring all the comments that are posted. And as you hear me discuss something or mention something or talk about something that you'd like to expound upon, or if you have something you'd like to add to my own musings, please feel free to chime in and offer whatever that might be. I wanted to discuss today in particular something that's been weighing heavy on me, and that is this sort of promise we have in the future for music and education, really just education in general. As so many of us are painfully aware, we are still fighting COVID-19. We are in the midst of this global pandemic, and it is difficult to process, especially for educators, especially for parents, but really every individual has been touched by this at some point already. And we're trying to navigate not only what our lives are supposed to look like in the present moment, but also how we're supposed to move forward. I've mentioned this before to several different people in different ways. You know, something that I find sort of fascinating from a sociological perspective is that this is going to unite us across the globe. We are in a generation that is living through and, God willing, surviving this pandemic. We will get on the other side of this, but it is going to unite all of us. And there are very few things that we can articulate from an historical perspective that have done that. The last that I have from my own recollection, but just from studying, not necessarily experiencing it, is World War II. And please forgive me, I don't want to seem insensitive. I'm not drawing any direct comparisons from what we're living through now and World War II. And God forbid we find ourselves in that sort of a climate where we're dealing with war on top of everything else. But in terms of something that truly impacted the entire globe, that's the last thing I can think of. Any other major events that we've suffered, unfortunately, most of them political and surrounding, concepts of war, things like Vietnam or the Cold War, or if we're thinking of like the attacks on 9/11 for people that are watching from America, Those are all things that are relatively isolated, and everywhere else in the globe, people could be engaged with it or not engaged with it, considering their proximity to whatever the event was. But with this pandemic, everyone in the world has been affected by this, whether it was directly that they or someone that they love or know was infected and has hopefully survived that and is recovering, or if it was just their daily lives because of the effects on the economy and just general commerce. Businesses have been closing down and reorienting themselves. Schools have completely restructured themselves to appropriately practice social distancing. I mean, truly, we have all stopped and been humbled by what we're going through. On top of this global pandemic, we are also dealing with a reckoning of a consciousness to social justice issues and prejudice and discrimination that's existed for decades, centuries in America, in Western civilization in general, I think you could argue. But we're now also dealing with a reckoning to that consciousness of, after the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and so many more people of color and countless victims of police brutality and the militarization of law enforcement through the protests that have been going on. We have had to face the facts of systemic prejudice that exists within law systems, social and cultural structures, political structures in the United States. And that is having a profound effect on how we teach and what we teach, formally and informally. I bring that up because it's not just happening in schools. I mean, I've had very intense conversations with my own family and talking about, what it is that we know and we believe and why we believe those things and where those beliefs are coming from. And the education is not just happening in school. It's absolutely fascinating to see how people are engaging with these topics and dealing with this. And so I decided to, in the spirit of all those things, I decided to title today's episode "The Promise of Change," because we are all changing. Change is the one constant. We are all going through so much change because of the things that are happening in the world, but there is a promise of change that I think gives us hope, that we know things are not going to be the way they are right now forever. And we have this possibility, as difficult as it really is, to lean into that change and appreciate this opportunity to completely reimagine how we teach, how we learn, how we engage with each other, how we socialize, how we structure our governments and our municipalities, our law enforcement. It's extraordinary to be living through this. And I hope that when we are on the other side of so many of the struggles that we're facing, that we will be able to reflect on what it is that we're going through now and recognize that we appreciated this opportunity to not only change through the force of this pandemic and the social justice issues that are being waged in this country and around the world, not being forced to change, that is a part of the change, but also appreciating the change that has to happen to ensure equity, to appreciate diversity, to ensure inclusion, to care for others more than we care for ourselves. I mean, these are changes that we have the opportunity to make right now, and I think that's really powerful. So today I wanted to discuss this idea, the promise of change. Again, some change being forced, some that's out of our control, but also this opportunity we're being presented with to change on so many levels. So I see there's several people watching. I would love to hear from you what some of your concepts or ideas are around this need to change, this opportunity to change, and how you might be changing or experiencing change in unique ways. Please feel free to post your comments and add questions or things that you want us to discuss. To offer a little bit of structure, and I did this in the 10th episode when I sort of opened this conversation up, I wanted to refer to maybe a writing or just a sample of text that inspires me or helps me sort of process whatever the topic is. Today, we're talking about the promise of change and the hope and the possibilities that can bring. And of course, for anybody that knows me, I immediately turned to the one and only Maxine Green. I am a huge, to say that I'm a fan of her work is a true understatement. So much of my career and the way that I think about the arts and education are completely shaped by her thoughts. And I am so grateful for the legacy that she's left and the incredible amount of work, the writing that she has left to get us to think and to get us to question and be critical of what it is that we do as educators, as musicians, as artists, as citizens. I love everything that she's written, and I am slowly combing through her works, and I find myself returning to a lot of what I've already read to just dig deeper and to think with more intention. So I wanted to look at something that she published in the Journal of Pedagogy, Pluralism, and Practice, which was not a journal I'm necessarily familiar with. She published this in 1997. To be brutally honest, I'm not even sure if this journal is still around, but I love what I consider, and no offense to anyone that subscribes to this journal or uses this in their research, but to me, this seems relatively obscure. And I have noticed this trend in Maxine Green's writing that she has a lot of publications in a variety of journals, some that are well established, very prominent journals in the field of education and art. But then there are publications like this where there could be an argument that what she presents is somewhat redundant, or that you might see sort of a trend of recycling certain ideas or thoughts where she is in her career and in her writing. But I love, from a larger standpoint, that she plants these seeds, is the way that I see it, is that she's going into these journals that are not a part of her regular audience, and she talks about the things that she's struggling with, that she's promoting, that she's writing about, that she's thinking about, and she's reaching this whole new audience that she wouldn't have otherwise, because she's going into this journal. She's finding a way to get into that journal with a certain topic or a certain commonality, and then reaching this really broad audience. And I think we could learn from that. And Maxine Green is not the only person that's done it, but I love that she was this incredible literary scholar, an incredible writer in her own right, but just had a voracious appetite for reading and pulling from the literary arts to talk about the things that she discusses in her writing. And so, she has this sort of niche if you're looking at her works. And particularly for me, I struggle with reading a lot, and I didn't read a lot as a kid or even as an adult. I have very specific things that I like to read, and she's such an extraordinary reader and has read such an incredible breadth of literature, plays and prose and poetry and novels, and she references them in her works. And so a lot of the times I get frustrated because I don't have that connection to the literature that she has. But the ways in which she does it, I think she invites so many people to think with her about art and education and the possibilities that lie in there. And so, again, this is a relatively obscure journal for me, but what she offers, I think, is incredibly powerful, and it is eerily appropriate to what we're living through right now. I remember reading this and just sort of doing a survey of her literature and being really inspired by it, and then coming back to it when the pandemic began, and shortly after sort of the protests began to call for social justice across the country and the world. And I was struck by how apropos it all was. And this was published in 1997. And it was incredible to me how much what she was living through and writing about in the late 90s is now being paralleled over 20 years later, now in 2020. And it is frustrating to a certain extent that the things that she was being challenged by so many years ago are still present. But her thinking through those situations and what she has to offer through her writing, it really gives me hope. I love that she was thinking these things, and that we can work in harmony with her thoughts and create new possibilities, because she has laid this foundation, and she's sort of given us this permission academically to think this way about these struggles that she was having in the late 90s and that she was witnessing, and what arguably we're still dealing with now. It might have some new names in terms of how we engage with media, and it might have new names in terms of trends that we're experiencing right now, but the root of what it is that she talks about is still very present. So the title of this writing she offers is Teaching as Possibility, A Light in Dark Times. For those of you that may have already read this, I hope you can appreciate it. I'm going to be rereading this work and stopping occasionally just to offer some anecdotal, moments in which I think certain things resonate with me. But again, as I'm reading, please feel free, post comments and questions and engage in this conversation. This is not a lecture. I don't want it to be perceived that way. I would love to hear from you and get your thoughts, especially as you hear Green's words and there might be something that particularly resonates with you. And I'll, again, offer those moments anecdotally of things that really resonate with me. So if you're just joining us, welcome. To offer a little bit of structure to today, talking about the promise of change. That's our topic. I'd love to hear from you in the comments section, but I'm going to read through Maxine Green's Teaching as Possibility, A Light in Dark Times. It begins. Borrowing from a bitter poem by Bertolt Brecht, Hannah Arendt entitled A Book of Essays, Men in Dark Times, published in 1968. The poem that Arendt borrows from by Brecht says this, quote, "To posterity," she explained, spoke of the horrors taking place in the early days of Nazi rule in Germany and of the absence of outrage. Things were covered up, she wrote, by, quote, highly efficient talk and double talk, end quote. And she stressed how important it always is to have a space in which light can be shed on what is happening and what is being said. This is something that I highlighted. So this is Arendt referencing this Brecht poem. She says it's so important to stress how the importance or how significant it is to have a space in which light can be shed on what is happening and what is being said. Green continues, granted, our times may not be marked by the kinds of monstrosities associated with the Nazis, but dark times are no rarity, even in American history. In the darkest moments, she wrote, and that's Arendt, we still, quote, have the right to expect some illumination, and such illumination may well come less from theories and concepts than from the uncertain, flickering, and often weak light that some men and women in their lives and their works will kindle under all circumstances, end quote. I, and this is Green talking, view our times as shadowed by violations and erosions taking place around us. The harm being done to children, the eating away of social support systems, the savage inequalities in our schools, the spread of violence, the intergroup hatreds, the power of media, the undermining of arts and the lives of the young. And then I think of this light that some men and women will kindle under almost all circumstances, quoting Arendt. And that makes me ponder and sometimes wonder at the work that is and might be done by teachers at this problematic moment in our history. There is doubt, unquestionably, within and outside the schools, and there is dread. The poet Adrienne Rich was written some remarkable poetry about the different kinds of dread experienced by different people. When asked how, in the face of this, she could maintain such an affirmative attitude, she said, quote, if poetry is forced by the conditions in which it is created to speak of dread and of bitter conditions, by its very nature, poetry speaks to something different. That's why poetry can bring together those parts of us which exist in dread and those which have the surviving sense of a possible happiness, collectivity, community, a loss of isolation, end quote. Arendt and Rich, each in her distinctive voice, are speaking of the capacity of human beings to reach beyond themselves to what they believe should be, might be, in some space they bring into being among and between themselves. The two remind us, by speaking of an uncertain light and of something different, of what it signifies to imagine not what is necessarily probable or predictable, but what may be conceived as possible. All of those who have parented children or taught the young may resonate to this on some level, particularly when they recall the diverse, often unexpected shapes of children's growing and becoming. Many may find a truth in Emily Dickinson saying that, quote, the possibles flow fuse is lit by the imagination, end quote. Imagination, after all, allows people to think of things as if they could be otherwise. It is the capacity that allows a looking through the windows of the actual towards alternative realities. I love that last line by Green, and she has a fantastic book, a collection of her writings from different times called Releasing the Imagination, which I love to reference and I've read with some of my students at SPU. She says again, imagination allows people to think of things as if they could be otherwise. It is the capacity that allows a looking through the windows of the actual towards alternative realities. In that quote, I see this promise of change. I see this opportunity that exists for all of us. And the significance of imagination, the way that Green uses that word and that concept, is what needs to be stressed. Imagination is rooted in reality. It is grounded in your present situation. But the promise of imagination is that from the positionality that you're currently in, you're looking at what could be. And I love that. I think people can view imagination as sort of this dangerous word in which we release our sense of reality and we look towards this completely fictitious world that is not grounded in practical possibility, right? To imagine something is to break all of the restrictions and the parameters that you're living in and look past those things. And I think that is true, but you are still positioned in the here and now. So whatever it is that you are imagining that from the position you're currently in. And it is this imagination, and releasing the imagination, she talks about this quite heavily. It is in that imagination that we'd really discover freedom, because we change things by imagining the possibilities that exist. If we are only focused on what's happening here and now, nothing will ever change. But if we are rooted in where we are now and we can use our imaginations to look past that, that is where we discover freedom. That is where we discover change. It's not until we imagine what our lives could be like past our certain circumstances that we discover possibility, that we discover the opportunity for change. She starts to expound upon this. It is obvious enough that arguments for the values and possibilities of teaching acts, no matter how enlightened, within the presently existing system cannot be expressed through poetry, even as it is clear that the notion of teaching as possibility cannot simply be asserted and left to do persuasive work. The contexts have to be held in mind, as does what strikes many of us as a backward leaning, inhumane tendency in our society today. For all the apparent resurgence of Deweyan progressive thinking in the school renewal movement, parent bodies and community representatives in many places are explicitly at odds with what they believe is being proposed. They respond more readily to the media-sustained talk of standards and technology than they do to the idea of multiple patterns of being and knowing, to a regard for cultural differences, to an attentiveness when it comes to voices never listened to before. I love that last sentence. And this already to me is where we can start drawing the parallel to what we're going through right now. When we're trying to incite change, particularly in education, I think the community in general, and this is administrative communities, school boards, or the communities made up of parents and students, are caught up in what the media drives as significant in education, the problems that are getting the most camera time. But if we can shift that focus, and she says, respond more readily to not respond more readily to the media sustained talk of standards and technology, which is something we're definitely dealing with right now, and look more at the idea of multiple patterns of being and knowing, to regard cultural differences and have an attentiveness to what comes from the voices never listened to before. I love that call for action. Green continues, Teachers who are consciously and reflectively choosing themselves as participants in school renewal are being challenged to clarify their beliefs and more often, to defend their practices. If the discourse they are developing can be infused with the kinds of metaphor that reorient ordinary common sense thinking, if they can break through more often what John Dewey called the crust of conventionalized and routine consciousness, when attention is turned to the school, neighborhood or district discussions may be moved beyond the customary and the self-regarding. If the fears and suffering of local people, some of them feeling themselves to be ignorant and powerless, can be taken into account, what Paulo Freire called a pedagogy of hope might even take form, and dialogue of a different sort might take the place of the language of prescription or complaint or demand. If teachers can begin to think of themselves as among those able to kindle the light Arendt described, or among those willing to confront the dread and keep alive the sense of a possible happiness, they might find themselves revisioning their life projects, existing proactively in the world. Paying heed to the repetitive drumbeat of current concerns for professional development, standard setting, authentic assessment, and enriched knowledge base, technological expertise, teachers but occasionally ask themselves, to what end? Can I get an amen from somebody in the comments? I think in particular, as we're preparing for this new school year, these are the things that we're facing directly. I want to read this list again. She says, paying heed to the repetitive drumbeat of current concerns, which again, this was written in 97, but she lists them off. And I think this is exactly what we're dealing with right now. Concerns for professional development, standard setting, authentic assessment, enriched knowledge base, technological expertise. Teachers cannot help but ask, to what end? When do we reach the goals in these expressed concerns? When is it, quote unquote, enough as we target these specific concerns and invest so much time and resources into it? I think, and I'm putting a few words into Maxine Green's mouth, I think the question really is not just to what end, but what are we losing in only focusing on teachers' professional development, expansive knowledge base, technological expertise? What are we losing when we focus on those concerns and we therefore lose sight to others? Green continues, there are, of course, the official announcements and prescriptions. There are presumably obvious goods linked to each statement of an educational goal. Most often, we realize the benefits of reform are linked to the nation's welfare, or to market expansion, or to technological dominance in a competitive world. Suppose, however, we were to summon up an articulation of purpose suggested by Rich's possible happiness, collectivity, community, a loss of isolation. My daughter is upset. Emily, you okay? Okay. This is how you know it's live. I think she's okay. She's playing in the front yard. Just to make a few of you jealous that might be watching from Texas, it's currently only 69 degrees in Seattle, Washington. I do not miss the summer heat in Texas. I do miss my family and my friends. It is weird being in a totally new place in the country, but it being the middle of August and having a day where the high is in the 60s, it's pretty spectacular. So Green is positioning us in this argument about what it is that we're focusing on through these changes. I want to back up a little bit. She says, suppose, however, we were to summon up an articulation of purpose suggested by Rich's, quote, possible happiness, collectivity, community, a loss of isolation, end quote. The words imply a reaching out for individual fulfillment among others in, perhaps, the kind of community in the making John Dewey called democracy. For those that don't know, Maxine Green is considered a Dewey scholar. She references Dewey quite heavily and has studied all of his works. She also leans heavily on Hannah Arendt, as well as several other authors. She talks about Paulo Freire and critical pedagogy, but she's definitely considered a Dewey scholar. She continues, the words imply a reaching out for individual fulfillment among others, and perhaps the kind of community in the making John Dewey called democracy. They are, to a degree, abstract, metaphorical. But speaking indirectly as they do, they respond to some of the evident lacks in our society, to the spaces where people feel solitary and abandoned, to domains of felt powerlessness. And hello to Carlene Beamer, my very first orchestra director in A-Leave ISD. Sending you lots of love from Seattle. I'm glad that you're watching, and I am definitely enjoying the temperatures up here. It's so good to hear from you through this platform. I'm so grateful. I hope you are enjoying retirement, and I'm so grateful to have had you as a part of my life. Carlene Beamer is an incredible educator and originally a trombonist, but also plays viola and was my first orchestra director and got me started on my official journey of instrumental music education. Love you, Miss Beamer. It's so good to hear from you. So returning to Green's text, I think it's really significant for us to start asking these questions, especially as we're getting ready for the fall. You know, what is the professional development you're engaged with? What are the concerns? What are you focused on? And when you ask that question, I think you also have to ask responsibly, what are you not focusing on? You know, when we have these concerns in front of us, it's important to have focus. It's important to look at something specific, but then we have to be careful about what we are setting aside. I don't want to say that we're ignoring, because I know, especially for myself, there are so many things that are present in my mind when I'm thinking of my students and when I'm thinking about my teaching. But I think it can be challenging to find a balance as we enter the beginning of another school year, particularly when we're doing it in the midst of a pandemic, to stay focused on what's pertinent right now, the immediate emergencies, the fires that have to be put out for us to be effective, but also what then has to take a back seat and how that will ultimately affect our students when we enter the classroom. Daniel, a new friend for me. It's so good to hear from you, sir. I'm glad you're enjoying my chimes. Yeah. I have a few questions, some more nuanced than others. I want to read through these so that I can get a sense of what you're asking about. Here are some of the questions. Daniel says, how do you change school culture that actively discourages teachers from being socially progressive and or actively political? It's an excellent question. Should there be a centralized federal government approach to education? For example, creating a specific group of educators and leaders in subject fields that collaborates to create an evolving national curriculum. Daniel, thank you so much for those questions. I think Arendt sort of hit, or not Arendt, well, yes, Maxine Green talking about Arendt partially, but really Green in general hints at this at the beginning of this text about the significance of teachers seeing themselves as a light in dark times. It's really the whole purpose of this essay that she writes. But she wants us to see ourselves, as Arendt talks about, in the midst of the darkest and most tumultuous times, there are those people that hold on vigilantly to the small flicker of flame that they have to light the way for the rest of us. And Green is positing in this essay that that's what teachers do, is that we are that small glimmer of hope for so many of the students that we engage with. So there are a lot of different ways that I want to address that question. And Daniel, I'm so grateful for it, because this is something that I hope to do in my career as an educator of future educators. As most people know, I taught for 8 years in public schools in Central Texas, and I wanted to see change in education. I was frustrated by a lot of the systems that I was working with and within. And I recognize that a way that I could affect real change is by educating future generation of educators, of empowering them to have a voice and encourage their professional agency as they went into the field. It is a reality that I think more people need to embrace, that we can look at a lot of political, social, systemic changes, particularly within education, but those changes only come to bear within the classroom. So when we see the politicalization or the publishing of big reform initiatives and such, the reform initiatives don't really mean anything until they're activated in the classroom. So it's great to publicize it. It's great to create an awareness, but I think very few people recognize the significance of the teacher and how much power and autonomy educators really have. It's one thing for a superintendent or a principal, or even if we're looking beyond that, for the National Education Association or someone to enact some sort of a national curriculum. If a teacher in the classroom doesn't utilize it, it has no significance. It really doesn't. And I would even argue if the teacher in the classroom doesn't believe in it, it really has no power. You could still be presenting something but not believe that it's effective, and the students can see that, and they experience that when teachers don't give credit to whatever initiative is being put in front of them. There's a lot of great work that's been done in that. I've been fortunate to do a lot of research into Teacher Professional Agency. There's a great book that's written by Mark Priestley and Sarah Robinson and Gert Bista, entitled Teacher Agency, where they talked about some of this professional sense of agency that teachers have. And they did sort of a really awesome qualitative research project. They were interviewing and looking at teachers in Scotland when they passed this national curriculum initiative. And they talked about how the teachers felt with that and how they wrestled with that. And they offer some really great testimonies of how teachers engaged with this new curriculum. Veteran teachers that just saw it as the newest thing and that it would, go by after a few months or a few years. And so they didn't put a lot of investment in it. And so it didn't show up in their classroom, and their students performed accordingly. And that's not to insinuate that the students performed good or bad, but they were performing based off of the teacher's engagement with the curriculum. So it's not that the curriculum worked or didn't work. It really rested on the shoulders of the educator. And then there were younger educators, arguably more naive, very wrapped up in the significance and the importance of a national curriculum being adopted. And so they really dove headfirst into that, and their students performed accordingly. And part of the argument that I think is made is a lot of it had less to do with the curriculum and more to do with the engagement of the educators, how they presented the curriculum and utilized it in their classroom. The significance of how they were teaching is what was important. The curriculum did not offer some magic key. No curriculum does, to suddenly unlock students' learning. It is the educator that is doing that. So that's my way of sort of addressing your second question. It may or may not surprise certain people that know me that I do not believe in a sort of national governance of education across the country. I think that it is very important for there to be a federal mandate for equity and inclusion in education. This is something that is brought forth through what we see through Title IX, through 504, Section 504, through special education initiatives. It's very important for us to have federal regulation of equity and inclusion in our schools. So all students, capital A, all students deserve and should have access to a free and equal education in our country. I firmly believe that. I believe that needs to happen all over the world. That needs to happen. And when I say equal education, I'm talking about equal access to a competitive and rich education compared to what's happening around the world. So access to technology, into educated educators. I mean, the education should not just be tapping you into a school that offers a limited resources. It needs to be competitive with what's going on around the world, and we need to be more connected. So I digress. That's sort of a different conversation in terms of quality of education. And I think to a certain extent, the federal government can ensure a quality of education. But the idea that there is a national curriculum that everyone should follow, that there are particular things that should be taught in certain ways, which is what curriculum helps articulate, I am opposed to that. I don't think that's important because, and I actually just had this conversation with someone yesterday, the way in which I am teaching in Seattle, Washington should not be the way that my colleagues are teaching in Austin, Texas. It should not be the way that my colleagues are teaching in New York City. It is not the way that people should be teaching in Phoenix, Arizona. You need to be teaching your community. In the state of Washington, we have what's called a local control system for education, in which most of the control in terms of curriculum and budgeting and hiring and what's happening within school districts happens at the local level within each school district, which is governed by a duly appointed, community-appointed school board. Ideally, the school board reflects the community through that election process. And so the community really is in charge of the education that's happening. And I think that is a beautiful and appropriate design. Is it always effective? No. Are there possibilities for change? always. And so I don't want to seem naive in asserting that local control systems, particularly that are run by conscious school boards elected by peers, is the only way or the most effective way. I mean, I think there's a possibility for change, but conceptually, philosophically, I firmly believe in the idea of local control. If anything, the federal government needs to ensure that the quality and the equity is sustained. But having, so-called experts, this one person that determines quality of education and access to resources and resources that should be allowed, I think that's very dangerous, very dangerous. And I think it puts too much control on individuals. And at least if you do have those individuals, it has been done relatively well from my perspective. So things like the national coalition that created a national curriculum for the arts, a lot of, yeah, you can have another banana, buddy. Sorry, banana time. Here you go, bud. What do you say?
Thank you.
You're welcome. So I think it has been done relatively well because with a lot of the national curricula, what we see is a suggestion. And so that's, as an example, so there's a National Coalition for the Curriculum for Arts that was established, and it is written as a suggestion. Not all states adopted it, but a lot of states saw it as this great foundation, and then they edited it. So I am in a state that did that. So the state of Washington has Washington state standards for all art curriculum. And there is an expectation that teachers are honoring that curriculum. But because there's not a state assessment for it, a lot of it's driven by assessment. Every educator can sort of make their own decisions on how they engage with that curriculum. It really is just a guideline. And all curriculum should really be seen that way. I think people, again, it becomes really a charged word that people assume that curriculum are meant to be followed to the T, and it's not true. Curriculum are a suggestion that are usually manufactured within specific contexts. So you have to understand the context of the curriculum to know if it's going to work for your students. And more importantly, as you're utilizing a curriculum to teach a certain topic, you have to know when it's effective and when it's not. It might be really great for teaching, about animal cells, and it's got this great section on mitochondria, and it's this really good curriculum for that. But then when you start talking about ecosystems, it fails to represent the knowledge that you believe your students should have, or it fails to connect with your students in a certain way. So you have to pull outside of that curriculum. So we have to be careful, I think, with establishing, quote unquote, like the curriculum for certain topics, especially in the arts. I don't think there is one way of seeing things. This is something I struggled with for colleagues that I have in Texas. I always had an issue with the prescribed music list. So for those that might not know, for a lot of the contests and festivals that took place in the state of Texas, there was this list of music that was appropriate for contest, which is called the PML, the prescribed music list. And it is, I guess, an argument you could make is peer reviewed. It is not necessarily a journal, or it is published. It is a publication that you can have access to. But there are committees that decide what is added to the prescribed music list. So arguably, it's not created in a vacuum, although you can get into those conversations of politics and representation in terms of how are those committees established and who actually sits on them, and are they representative of the schools that of the schools and programs that have to abide by the prescribed music list. But again, I digress. But I just was always just frustrated by it conceptually, that there was a list of music that was quote unquote appropriate. And although, yes, I know what I'm saying is controversial, because we can talk about lack of standard or quality or whatever it is, that, if all music is up for grabs, if you can teach and learn and perform anything in the music classroom, how do you ensure an equity of the curriculum or a good cross section of all the music that exists? And my answer is you don't. And I know that some people might disagree with that, but you could never ensure an appropriate equity of exposure to music. Music is ever evolving and changing, and it has this incredible, it's centuries old, millennia of composers and music that exists. So to say that you're going to cover in your sixth grade classroom all music is irresponsible to claim that you could do that. Even to say that someone professionally, I'm a professional musician, I have graduate degrees in music, I still have not learned about all the music that exists. So to say that teachers and public school are required to do that is very irresponsible. That being said, why do we still hold on to this idea that we're required to do that? That our curriculum is supposed to be representative of quote unquote all music or quote unquote the best music. What's wrong with getting lost, if you will, in a specific genre for an entire year? And what's wrong if that genre happens to be popular music? What's wrong if that genre happens to be steel drum music from the Caribbean? What's wrong if your percussion ensemble ends up playing steel drums an entire year? I mean, is there a problem with that? Why does it have to be a certain structure, a certain function? And I think it is important to applaud the incredible work that's being done in Southern California, in New Mexico, and in Texas in particular with mariachi programs. I was very fortunate to work with Juan Cavazos, who's an educator at San Marcos High School, who helped us reestablish the mariachi program in San Marcos CISD where I was working. And I loved this idea that we're not just going to look at band, choir, and orchestra, wind ensemble, string ensemble, and vocal ensemble. Let's look past that. If there is a desire to make music through the mariachi ensemble, through this unique ensemble, and there's repertoire that we can explore there, what's wrong with that? Why can't we do that? Why can't we establish to have that ensemble and have that ensemble all year? Who says that the string orchestra has to play classical music? And I'm talking about classical music with a big C, right? So anything that employs Western European, art instruments. Why does it have to be that way? What if you had an entire year where you didn't play music by classical composers with a big C, or a little c for that matter? What if you didn't play music from the classical era? I mean, is that wrong? One of the great benefits that we have in teaching in public school is that, for the most part, we engage with our students for more than 1 year. Our colleagues that are teaching chemistry or geometry or world literature, they have 1 year to impact their students. But we will usually have our students, in the case of primary school teachers, you can have them upwards of 6 or 7 years. In middle school, you can have them for 3 years, 2 years in some instances, or maybe even 4 years, depending on the structure in your district, if you're like a 5th through 8th grade campus. And in high school, we know that we're going to have them for 4 years. In college, we're going to have them for 4 years. So what's wrong with thinking programmatically and thinking, okay, well, this year there seems to be this interest or this desire to talk about dubstep. I mean, perhaps that's something your students are really interested in. What's wrong if you spend a few weeks developing dubstep, exploring its history and its cultural reference, and performing some pieces that include dubstep or that are popular in dubstep, or arranging works, creating new works that fall under that genre? Why can't you do that? What is it that our students have lost in terms of a music education if they are not performing prescribed music? Because I would argue the goal of a music education is to experience music. And music is a lot more than a small list of composers determined by somebody else to be significant. Music is melody and harmony and dynamics and articulation, and how all of those things work together, and how many different people across multiple social and cultural historical groups have used those variables to express themselves artistically. So we should be talking about those things, and those are all inherent in all types of music. So to say that you're going to pick one genre and explore it, it's not that students are going to suddenly lose their music education. They're still going to be learning about music. They're just going to be learning about it through a new genre. So forgive me, I'm going on a bit of a tangent, but I hope you can appreciate how those are connected to the question that Daniel posed. Didn't you say mariachi is also a huge component of music ed in New Mexico as well? Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I can admit, I mean, if I'm going to humble myself, I could openly admit, I struggled with the mariachi program at first. I, like anyone, had that fear. We've created this culture of competition for arts in public schools, and it frustrates me. You hear me give this heavy sigh because I think it pits us against each other, and we lose sight that all of us are teaching the arts, or all of us are teaching music, and it becomes who has the biggest numbers and who performed better at a contest. Or that's not the way anyone should be learning. We see this same struggle, and people are, talking against it and have been for decades with standardized assessments. Well, this teacher's class outperformed that teacher, or this school district is outperforming that school district. Competition is not a way to promote education. That is not the way that we should be learning, is by competing with each other, because everybody can learn something, and we should appreciate the diversity of what it is that we're learning and how we're learning it. This is something that Green talks about frequently, and what she's already hinted at the beginning of this essay. So yeah, I mean, I was a little afraid because I was in that competitive mode of, well, I'm struggling to build my numbers and having retained my students. And what if my students only want to do mariachi, and so then they quit orchestra and I'll lose those kids? And I had to recognize students that might be interested in joining mariachi. They're doing that because they have a desire to express themselves artistically using mariachi music. So am I really in the position, am I really going to assume the authority to take away the voice of my student? And I know that might sound somewhat dramatic, but I really believe that's what happens. That is what we're doing, is you are telling this student, no, you shouldn't express yourself that way, or I don't want you to express yourself that way, because the way I am encouraging you to express yourself is better. We need to learn how to express ourselves through music only using Mozart or Bach or Beethoven or whomever it might be, right? I think that's irresponsible. That's inappropriate. If you have a student that says, that's maybe a violinist in this case, and man, I love the sound of mariachi, and I'm interested in joining that ensemble, and I want that to happen for me. I want to be able to express myself through mariachi. Why do you have the right to keep the student from doing that? And how does that in some way condemn what you're doing with string literature and a string orchestra, or a string orchestra program is what I'm assuming in terms of context of teaching in public schools? I think there's some ego that's in that. At least I'm speaking for myself. There was a lot of my ego assuming that it reflected poorly on me. And I want to think about that for a second. How is the taste of an individual reflecting poorly on your pedagogy and your program? And for administrators that might insinuate that, if you suddenly had a few students, I don't even like to use the phrase lose a few students to another program, because you're not losing the students. Those students are still receiving a music education. Can I get an amen? I mean, I think that's what we're ignoring. If a student leaves the band and joins orchestra, that's because they wanted to be in orchestra and they're still receiving a music education. If a student decides to leave choir, maybe they don't want to be in the chorale or the concert choir anymore because they really just want to be in the jazz ensemble. You haven't lost that student or lost that voice. Their voice is just being utilized to express what they want to say through music. So again, I think that's something that's systemic. I think that's a culture that we're perpetuating, that we all need to be in competition with each other. I think that's the issue of evaluating education by numbers, by only, I should say, looking at education through numbers. The numbers can be beneficial, and they can help arguments to support the arts. But when we're only looking at how many kids are in your program, how many of them won medals this year or trophies, and what's your retention, and how much money did you get in your fundraiser, I think that we're losing sight of the purpose of education. So I digress. Obviously, that's another way that we could shift this conversation, but it's a very slippery slope. And I go back to where I started in this point, that I absolutely was scared of seeing another music program and worrying about a limited number of resources having to be shared somewhere else, and that I was losing students. But ultimately, I recognized, and I was so grateful to have colleagues that helped me in that journey, to recognize that I wasn't losing students. My students were still receiving a music education. And if anything, they were being further enriched and rewarded in their musical journey because they were finding something they were passionate about. They weren't tolerating, as it were, music that I chose or that I selected for them that I thought was significant. They were gravitating towards something that they had the choice to make. Their own agency and learning was being promoted. So for those of you still watching, I know that this has turned into a relatively different conversation, but Daniel, I hope that addressed some of the things that you asked, and thank you for those very thoughtful questions. Those are so powerful. I'm grateful to know Daniel now. For those of you that are not familiar with him, I'd ask that you look him up on social media. He has launched an incredible project where he's promoting the work of diverse composers and finding work in the public domain and arranging them for ensembles that can, I say diverse ensembles, but ensembles that can be structured in different ways. So he's doing it in sort of a choral fashion of sort of 5 parts. He's got a couple different versions of this, but you can sort of have part 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. If you guys are familiar with the Flex Band series, it's similar to that, so that you can kind of mix instruments. So it's not just first and second violin, viola, cello, bass, right? Or a typical wind ensemble structure. It allows you to sort of mix and collaborate with people and explore the music of diverse composers from marginalized communities. So, Daniel, I'm so grateful for that work that you're doing. If you can, in the comments, please provide a link to your website and let people be able to see what that is, since we're making reference to it. I also, as time always goes so fast, before time gets away from us, I wanted to offer a link to a PDF of this essay that I was reading from by Maxine Green. So I'm going to go ahead and post those in the comments for anyone that wants to be able to read that essay. We only got through a small portion of it. And I think with the few minutes that we have left, Green has started to hint at some of the social and cultural issues that we're challenged with in education. And I wanted to go a little further in because she talks about something that is just terrifyingly appropriate to what we're going through now. So with these last 5 minutes, just a few things I want to draw out before we leave. If situations cannot be created that enable the young to deal with feelings of being manipulated by outside forces, there will be far too little sense of agency among them. Without a sense of agency, young people are unlikely to pose significant questions, the existentially rooted questions in which learning begins. Indeed, it is difficult to picture learner-centered classrooms if students' lived situations are not brought alive, if dread and desire are not both given play. There is too much of a temptation otherwise to concentrate on training rather than teaching. Amen. To focus on skills for the workplace rather than any possible happiness or in any real consciousness of self. Drawn to comply, to march in more or less contented lockstep, sneakered, baseball caps, t-shirted, familiar with the same media-derived reference, many youngsters will tacitly agree to enter a community of the competent, to live lives according to what is. There are, of course, young persons in the inner cities, the ones lashed by savage inequalities, the ones whose very schools are made sick by the social problems the young bring in from without. Here, more frequently than not, are the real tests of teaching as possibility in the face of what looks like an impossible social reality at a time when few adults seem to care. There are examples in Mike Rose's work on Possible Lives, for instance, where he expresses his belief that a defining characteristic of good teaching is a tendency to push on the existing order of things. I love that quote, and she continues and then brings in the work of Albert Camus. This is a fantastic philosopher if you're not familiar with him. This is not a purely fictional phenomenon. Too many teachers by now have read their students' journals and stories and poems. They have exposed themselves to many kinds of dread and many kinds of desire. Much of the suffering, much of the deprivation is due, quite obviously, to economic and social injustices. But there is a sense in which imagination and desire can feed the recognition of the need to transform and perhaps the passion to change. To have that sense is to be able to listen to what Wallace Stevens calls the man with the blue guitar who does not play things as they are. Imagination alters the vision of the way things are. It opens spaces and experience where projects can be devised, the kinds of projects that may bring things closer to what ought to be. Without such a capacity, even young people may resemble the inhabitants of the town of Oran, Albert Camus described at the start of The Plague. I wanted to put a link to the School of Life. If any of you are not familiar with the School of Life, it's an absolutely fantastic channel on YouTube. that does these wonderful little vignettes about philosophers and different ways of thinking. They're really, really powerful. And so they have a very short, it's like a 10-minute explanation of Camus' The Plague, this wonderful novel that he wrote. So I'm providing the link in the comments. This novel is centered in a small town in southern France in which a plague, an epidemic, affects the world and half the population dies. And again, this is terrifyingly similar to what it is that we're going through now. But he talks about the lives of the people living in this tiny village that are dealing with this pandemic. And so Maxine Green is making reference to this and talking about the capacity of young people to not be able to see past their certain circumstances. And she references that it's very similar to the inhabitants of Oran, this tiny village that Camus talks about in The Plague, where everyone is bored and devotes himself to cultivating habits. The point is made that you can get through the day without trouble once you have formed habits. In some other places, the narrator says, people have now and then an inkling of something different. They have had an intimation, and that is so much to the good. He did not necessarily mean an intimation of the end of the plague and a return to normal life. He meant perhaps an intimation of mortality, of injustice that has to be struggled against, of silences that have to be acknowledged and at once overcome. For us, that may imply a recognition, not solely of the human condition, but of the contradictions and what we think of as democratic society. Even to think about bringing about significant changes within the school is to contest on many levels the behaviorist, stratifying tendencies that still mark the culture as it impinges on the school. To encourage the young to develop visions of what might be, and then, against those visions, recognize how much is lacking and what it may be to strike against all sorts of easy platitudes that obscure the turmoil of change. Most of us realize that only when we envisage a better social order do we find the present one in many ways unendurable and stir ourselves to repair. The sight and description of the new schools at the present time, the coalition schools, the charter schools, the new vision schools, make it uniquely possible to identify what is wrong with the traditional schools. All we need to do is to take heed of what can happen when a junior high school girl caught in an overcrowded city school visits one of the new theme schools. Abruptly, she may notice what is lacking in her own school: a brightly decorated classroom, smaller groups and family circles, a breaking through of the 45-minute class period. Without witnessing a better state of things, she could not have realized what was lacking, what was wrong. And this is, going back to the beginning of our conversation to sort of wrap up for today, this is what I consider the promise of change. It is through the arts that we tap into our creativity and utilize our imagination to envision those things that are not. But it is art that shows us a promise of what can be. And it's when we experience that, as Maxine Green offers this allusion to a young girl stuck in a struggling school, that when they go out and experience things that have been imagined into reality, that we suddenly recognize the deficiencies of where we are now. And we then start to utilize our imagination and creativity to see what could be, to imagine the possible, and to find hope in that possibility. I cannot believe it's already been an hour. I'm so grateful to everybody that's watched today, to Daniel for your comments, and for Ms. Beamer for chiming in. It's always wonderful to connect with everyone, and I hope today's conversation has encouraged you to appreciate the promise of change and to lean into what it is that we're struggling with right now. All the things that we're struggling with, all of them are significant, and to know that this change is a possibility, to utilize the imagination that we have as artists and educators, and to envision what can be against what we have right now. I'm always grateful for all of you and the things that you offer me, the inspiration that you give me to continue these conversations. I look forward to speaking with you next week. I am actually moving. For those that might not know, my wife and I just purchased our very first home in Tukwila, Washington. And so we are so excited to be in this huge transition in our life. So I'm sad to say goodbye to my my apartment in Greenwood. I've been living here for a year now since we moved up to Seattle, and we have loved it. But we are going to be in a new space next week, so I'll be actually starting this conversation at my new home. I'm excited to share that space with you, and hopefully we'll have another beautiful day. I'll be able to do it in my new backyard. But so in this transition, I'll be securing our guest for next week. If you have any suggestions or things that you would like us to talk about, please feel free to provide those in the comments or send me a private message. Again, thank you for sharing this time with me today. I look forward to seeing you again in the future and talking with you, having more conversations about music and education. And I encourage you, please share this video. Tune in next week. Go to our archives on YouTube and see some of the other conversations that we've had. And please feel free to share those so that more people can be talking and imagining new possibilities for our future. Enjoy the rest of your day. See you next week.